Hey leaders, welcome to the Slingshot Group podcast. I'm your host, Tim Foote, CEO of Slingshot Group, where we build remarkable teams through staffing and coaching. And none of us wants to be the kind of leader who sticks their head in the sand and just does what they've always done. We want to be continually growing, continually leaning into learning from those around us and having influence on and in and through our teams. Well, this conversation today is for all of us. Clay Scroggins is our guest. Clay is a leadership coach. He's been a pastor. He's written amazing books, and he's got all kinds of insights that are going to help us on the journey today. So let's jump right in. Well, Clay, great to have you on the Slingshot Group podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, been looking forward to it. Have seen, personally witnessed the influence you've had on so many teams and leaders, and just to have you talk about some of your insights today, I know is going to be a benefit to so many. What's most energizing about the work you're doing these days?
That's a great question. I am doing a good bit of. I wrote some leadership books. I'm kind of an accidental leadership author and wrote them from a perspective of a pastor, wrote them really to pastors. But it's interesting how many people there are in the marketplace, in the business world, that care deeply about value-based, virtue-based, really kingdom-based leadership content. That's probably been the most invigorating, is seeing so many men and women. And I feel I've had moments of guilt that I didn't recognize this when I was a pastor. But now that when I get out into an organization, company, for-profit business that's, working in the HVAC industry or software or wherever it may be, and I see the way they're leading their team with such diligence and kindness and really trying to be intentional about caring well for people and developing people well, it's inspiring. That lie that we're so tempted to believe, that as you grow in your faith, you got to eventually go work in full-time ministry. I've realized that was more in me than I thought it was. So it's been really cool to see a different side of the world.
That's inspiring, Clay, and so much to learn from those teams and how they operate. There are some incredible books and resources out there for leaders at the top of an organization who are in charge. You call them the 1%. Right. And I think we both agree that there aren't enough resources out there for the 99% in the organization who are not in charge, trying to grow their leadership and influence. Your story and your books, like How to Lead When You're Not in Charge and The Aspiring Leader's Guide to the Future, have been a gift to everyone. And we've got both types of leaders listening today. So I can't wait to dive in and learn from you, your experiences, your insights, especially having led in a church context that's massive. I mean, I'm sure there aren't many things in churches that go on or ministries that go on, Clay, that you haven't experienced or seen. But then you talked about working with nonprofits, working with for-profit marketplace organizations, all kinds of teams. In your journey as a leader, was there a light bulb moment when things began to click around how to lead when you're not in charge?
Yes, there certainly was. And it was, at the time, it was a moment that I was not proud of, but it was really, it was the moment for me when things started to click. I was, as you mentioned, worked in a pretty large ministry context, North Point Ministries. At the time, we had probably 6 churches in the Atlanta area. Now there's maybe 8 or 9, and maybe 400 or 500, 600 employees, I think, at the time. And it was a pretty common matrix organization where you had a central organization, and then I was a campus pastor for about 10 years. And so the people at our local campus would report up to me, but we had the dotted line situation where you had the dotted line to your, whoever kind of was your ministry team lead. And I think it was over some student ministry sermons that Andy Stanley had heard that he thought were subpar. And so he asked me, classic, like, hey, can you swing by my office later today? Right. Nonchalant, and then I get there, and I mean, he was pretty calm about it, but he just had some questions. Why, I heard these sermons, they were not very good. What's going on? And they happened to be at the campus that I was leading. And it just was, unfortunately and regrettably, it was so natural for me to just blame I was blaming the central team. They're giving us subpar outlines, or the central team is getting it to us too late. And there was a moment in the conversation, the whole time he just kind of looked at me with a with this real perplexed way. And I don't know that he said these exact words, but it was almost as if he was saying, so you're going to allow your team to preach bad sermons because of someone else? Is that what you're trying to tell me? And I remember sitting there thinking, well, if you put it that way, it certainly doesn't make any sense, right? But I learned then that blame, anytime we find ourselves blaming, well, it's the central team's fault. It's another department's fault. It's my boss's fault. Blame is usually a great opportunity for us to smuggle our own problems into the future. And so, which is essentially what I was doing. I was, instead of taking ownership, instead of realizing that even though I didn't have the authority over that department, I had the opportunity to influence them, and I was missing a pretty significant opportunity to influence them that I needed to take more advantage of. So that moment, I mean, in the weeks after that, I remember just leaving there going, yes, something's not right in the way that I'm seeing organization. I found myself believing that lie that if you would just put me in charge of it, it would get better. But if I'm not in charge of it, then I'm just a victim to it. And the reality of that is it's one of the greatest myths of leadership that, title, position, authority is what makes a leader. And we all know that's certainly not true.
It's interesting listening to that, Clay. I mean, Leadership 101, Leadership one-on-one with Andy Stanley, I'm sure at times could be pretty overwhelming. And there'll be many leaders listening today that have worked for strong, amazing, healthy leaders. You're in a situation like that where he actually trusts you. That's why he's having the conversation with you. But self-preservation kicks in so strongly in those kinds of situations. How do you talk about the 4 behaviors of leading when you're not in charge, leading yourself, choosing positivity, think critically, reject passivity. How do you dial into those things when that whole instinct of self-preservation is kicking in strongly?
The reason why I felt like you have to begin with leading yourself, as we talk about this as I was digging into the conversation of leading without authority, or leading when you're not in charge, leading from the second chair, as people in the church world call it, I knew we had to start that conversation with leading yourself, because I think it really does. It starts with those personal habits, those disciplines that for most people, and I think for most great effective leaders, they start in the morning, right? I mean, you certainly can have habits throughout the day, but that morning routine, I think, is really where so much of, certainly where the day starts, but it really is where we, I think, have the greatest opportunity to dial into, as you mentioned, some of those key facets of cultivating influence when we might lack the authority that we think we need. I had a buddy in Atlanta who he did kind of an informal survey. He's a business leader who happens to be a Jesus follower. Sent a simple little survey to like 30 of the most influential leaders, most of them were in the Atlanta area, and just did this little simple, somewhat anecdotal, but somewhat research driven survey, just asking them, what are the habits that have made you successful? And of course, the most common habits, there were 3 or 4 of them that really rose to the top. One of them was getting up pretty early in the morning, right? Don't let the sun beat you up. If you're going to get it done, make sure to get it done before lunch. If it really has to get done, you better get it done before breakfast. Some kind of meditation in the morning, or, we would call, a lot of circles would call a quiet time, or some kind of contemplation on the Bible, some kind of introspection on what's going on in my own life. And then, some kind of moving your body, or having some kind of physical exercise. And so I think that's where it starts. And that's certainly where it started for me. I was journaling one morning, writing down, I was trying to answer the question, what am I trying to learn right now? And bumped into that statement. I'm trying to learn how to lead, even though I'm not in charge. I remember writing it down in my journal. And that was huge for me to kind of wrap my mind around the challenge of feeling like you don't have all the authority that you need or that you feel like you want. And so I think for leaders to dial into it, I think your best opportunity is those habits that you have, whatever that routine is that you have in the morning. A lot of times people say, oh, well, I'm not a morning person, which I always think about that Atomic Habits book by James Clear, where he says, well, as long as you're telling yourself that, you're not going to be a morning person, right? The first step is to stop saying that I'm not a morning person, because the reality is, if you would decide to wake up a few minutes earlier tomorrow morning, you could do it. And then as you begin to do that, it hopefully can just snowball. But yeah, that would be the place that I would encourage people to start is first thing in the morning.
So I guess what you're saying, Clay, is it starts outside the room. I mean, if you're leading
That's right.
yourself well,
That's right.
then you're going to handle the self-preservation urge when you're in the room. You know, it's interesting when you're talking about those things that got you where you are. I think a whole other podcast episode could be a simple thing around consistency. It's like being consistent with those habits. And we know that will lead to consistent leadership, which hopefully will lead to healthy leadership. In the ministries, organizations we work with, churches, nonprofits, it's not uncommon to quickly see that there's a disconnect between those in charge and those who are not. And you learn early on that influence in an organization is not always reflected, often not reflected on an org chart, which is why when we're with organizations, we do a lot of question asking and a lot of listening. I know you do too, Clay. And I can think of organizations we work with where decisions are made and strategy lives and dies through the influence of somebody well down on the org chart, but who's been there a long time and has developed and grown a lot of trust. I'd imagine you've experienced and seen the same and can uniquely speak to all kinds of positional leadership. But first, talk to the person in charge that has both leadership and influence. What are some of the consistent blind spots you see of leaders at the top of an organization that are holding themselves and their teams back?
Well, that in the book you mentioned, Aspiring Leaders Guide to the Future, I tried to take some of the ways that we've thought about leadership in the past that might have worked in the past, but just aren't going to work in the future, that really trying to leverage that. I don't know if you're in Colorado, Tim, so you've got a greater shot of it than I am, but do you follow hockey at all?
Yeah, some.
Yeah.
I'm more of a football, basketball guy, but I know about the puck.
Me as well. That quote, it's a quote by Wayne Gretzky, I believe, that it gets thrown around in leadership circles or business circles a lot, but you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate to where the puck is going to be, right? And so I think this is such a huge conversation because leadership certainly is changing. And as it changes, the question is, are you and I developing into the kind of leader that the future is going to demand? And, in so many ways, the future is now. But that idea of command and control, the idea of I'm going to use my power, I'm going to leverage my power to get people to do what I want them to do. I would say the more you have to do that, the less effective you're going to be as a leader. And I think that's certainly true now. And I think that's going to be even more true in the future, because the kind of leader that we want to follow is not the kind of leader that has to say, I'm the boss and therefore I need you to get this done. I was talking about this concept and somebody came up recently after the talk and said, oh, I'm sure you're familiar with that quote from Game of Thrones, which I have never seen Game of Thrones, but I kind of know in general what it's about. And I said, no, please, tell me what quote you're thinking of. And he said, oh, well, the wise sage kind of person sitting in the room makes this really remarkable statement, says, anyone who has to tell everyone he's the king is no king at all. And I would say that's the first place to start, is find those moments, pay attention to those moments when you're having to leverage your power or leverage your authority to get something done. And when you're doing that, as much as you can, I would resist the urge to do that and instead figure out, okay, how do I need to cultivate influence? Whether I have the authority or not, how can I cultivate influence? Because that ultimately is going to be what moves people the most. I mean, parenting, I see this so much in parenting, right? Because when your kids are little, you're the cop, right? I mean, you can be no, don't stand on the couch. Don't eat dessert before the meal, right? Those laws that we put out there for our kids. But as kids get older, you have to make that transition that we've all heard before, right? From being the coach to being or from the cop to the coach to ultimately the consultant, where you might in your mind have authority. You might think you have authority, but in the end, that kid ultimately is growing up into a person who can do whatever it is they want to do. And the question will be, do you have the influence to be able to make a difference in their life, which I would imagine, hopefully you do. So I would say start there. Start with those moments. Pay attention to the moments when you're trying to leverage your position to move people, and then as much as you can resist that.
Yeah, your parenting analogy is striking a chord with me, Clay, having two teenagers, 16 and 14.
There you go.
I'm having a lot more conversations rather than making statements, asking questions. Oh, that's interesting. So how will that play out? But
well, I'm sorry. Yeah. Can I add to that? I mean, Tim, I didn't think about that when I was writing this book, the How to Leave You're Not in Charge stuff. But I would say probably every other time I speak on the topic, somebody will come up afterwards and say, these principles really apply to parenting. And obviously I hadn't thought about that, but now the more I've thought about that, the more I realize that really is so true, because if you got to lean on your authority as a parent, again, it might work when they're toddlers, but it's going to eventually stop working.
Yeah, it corrodes relationship, is what you're saying.
It does,
and we don't want to lose relationship. Number one, with our kids. It's interesting you talk about how that can relate to, or that can drift to brute force.
Yes,
and brute force equals toxic culture.
That's
and I'm
right.
sure you step into a lot of situations where you have to work about healing culture that has become toxic. Speak to the leaders today that have dysfunctional teams and their responsibility to bring about health.
Yeah, I'm kind of grinning as you're talking about it, Tim, because I think, you and I have talked about some of those particular cultures before, but yeah, that's a hard thing when there's a culture embedded, or where that's all they've known for a while, where there was a leader who relied on the weapon of authority, right? To be able to, I call it I'm in Georgia, so we might be a little more liberal with guns than you might be in Colorado. So we call it, if you want to use the term, there's plenty of hunters in Colorado as well, but that idea of the weapon of authority, right? Waving the gun, like if you don't get it done by the end of the day, you're done. Recovering from that, you're right, is not easy. I mean, it's you have to learn. It's a completely new way of influencing others. I mean, the place I like to start is I like to go to Mark 8, 9, and 10 and just walk through those conversations that Jesus had both on the road with his disciples and then eventually sitting down together in a house where they come to him and say, hey, who's the greatest, right? And they're all wanting, and at no point in time does he chastise them or condemn them for wanting to be the greatest. Instead, he says, if you want to be the greatest, great. I love that. But just remember that the path toward greatness is not toward power. It's toward leveraging whatever it is you have and pouring it out on behalf of others. And then he makes that ridiculously powerful but simple line where he says, hey, those who are regarded as leaders over the Gentiles and they leverage their authority over others. It's almost like, I think of it as like they love keeping people under their thumb. They love leveraging their power to manipulate people and to move people. And then he looks, you can just feel the power in this moment where he looks straight in his followers' eyes and says, not so with you. Do not do it that way. Resist the urge to do that, but instead serve, and instead be like me, who, it's where really the Gospel of Mark turns on its head. He says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So I think it starts there. What I try to do in a culture like that is let's go back to the very basics of the way God designed this world and the plan that Jesus laid out for us in regard to how we're to influence and affect other people. And at the very core of it, we see him cautioning us to use our power, but instead learning a new way, a different way of leadership. I think that is where it all begins, and certainly a great place to start.
Well, as I'm listening to that, Clay, and you using that example from Jesus chatting with his disciples, again, a parenting moment. Yeah, it's okay if you want that, but this is what you're going to need to do. And this is what it means. Again, it's a great parenting principle. So now for the rest of us, Clay, who might not be in charge, we've got our own blind spots. What are the blind spots that hold us back from greater influence?
Yeah. First of all, recognizing that your boss has a harder job than you, whether empirically that's true or not, I think it's best to convince yourself of that, because you'll have a greater opportunity to affect your boss or to influence your boss if you believe that. I mean, you're in a pretty significant position of authority at this point in your life. You've been in lesser positions of authority. I would imagine you would agree with that the more responsibility, the bigger the title, the higher you get on an org chart, the more challenging it is. It just is that way. And it doesn't mean there aren't perks. It doesn't mean there aren't great things about being able to be in charge. But I think when I was, in my 20s and was just starting out in ministry, I would look at people that were in positions of authority and particularly even in our organization. And I would think, oh, must be nice, right? Must be nice to be able to do whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do it. I can't wait till I get there. And the more experience I got in an organization, the more I realized, oh, that's just not true, that my boss has a harder job. My boss sees things that I don't see. My boss is dealing with pressure that I'm not dealing with. My boss, it's just more complicated than I could ever imagine it to be. And so convincing yourself that resisting the blind spot of, no, she's got it easier than I've got it. I would just say, no, that's not going to work for you. That's not going to help you as much as you can convince yourself otherwise. And then I would also say resisting another common blind spot is just, I don't have any opportunity to influence in the position I'm in, or I'm not high enough in the org chart to be able to make a difference. And so I'm just biding my time. I'm just sitting on my hands, or I'm going to leave and go do my own thing where I can really kind of pave my own way. I would say neither of those is true either. That the reality is, if there are leaders who are in charge who are not leading well, then certainly there are leaders who are not in charge that are making a huge difference in the world. You reference that in any org chart, any organization, you might find a couple layers beneath. Oh, hey, this is the person that's really got a lot of influence. And it's not just like someone has given that person a lot of influence. That man or that woman has cultivated that influence through faithfulness, through insight, through thinking about things, through diligence, through a posture of positivity. And that, if it's possible for them, it's possible for us. And if it's possible for them, my hope is that any leader at any level, at any point in time, could be dropped into a situation or a moment and know how to cultivate influence from that position. And so that's what I would encourage as you mentioned it, that 99, 90, 98, 99% of the rest of the organization that feels like, well, must be nice to be the senior leader. I'll just wait until I get there, right?
Yeah, there's always opportunity for influence, Clay. And that's a great reminder. I mean, I remember back in my early days of ministry, when I didn't supervise any staff, I had to motivate volunteers. And it was those skills learned then that still serve me today. I mean, there's so many stories. You think of the Apostle Paul and the influence that he developed in prison and the lives that he saved. And there are people doing that in prison today. There is always opportunity for influence. Right. And part of leadership in general, but part of leading up is knowing when and how to handle conflict and challenge authority in a productive way. It's required of all of us, but most of us have to learn the hard way on how to do this well. What are the do's and don'ts of leading up well?
I wrote a couple of chapters on this and sent it to a friend of mine, and he said his feedback was, gosh, it just feels a little, it feels too much, too many principles and not enough story. And that was such great feedback for me. I mean, I deleted his number and I've never spoken to him since, haven't spoken to him since then because I was so offended. But no, that was great. It was great feedback. And it really made me think, and it made me do a little bit different kind of research. I had to go, okay, where have we seen this? Like, what's an example of this? What's a story that I can tell instead of just trying to give some principles? And so I bumped into being in Atlanta. We got loads of Chick-fil-A influence. We're awfully proud. What a wonderful organization Chick-fil-A is. And talking to some friends that work there, asking them about this, they turned me on to an operator who's actually in Athens, Georgia, where the University of Georgia is, had been running his restaurant for maybe 15 or 20 years, had garnered a lot of influence within the organization, was seen as a trusted operator. And so I think that's important to know, that this wasn't somebody who was 6 months in that was decided to try some new things. But he had built up a level of respect and trust and influence because of his faithfulness. And as I ended up interviewing him about this conversation, he said over and over again, they would have customers that would come in and they would say, hey, love the ice cream, or the ice dream is what Chick-fil-A called it then. But what about a milkshake? When are you guys going to do a milkshake? Everybody wants a milkshake. You know what would go great with this chicken sandwich is a milkshake. And he kept throwing that feedback to the central the central team, I was going to say the ministry strategy team, the menu strategy team, right? But probably akin to the ministry strategy team. Mm-hmm. And he had kept giving them that feedback, and they hadn't done anything with it, or at least they hadn't found a way to do it in a way that would be able to roll it out in a way that their restaurants could handle. And so he said, well, I'm just going to give it a shot. And he was really quick to tell me as well. Now, he said if this were in the age, he said social media was just becoming extremely popular. But nowadays, he says, I don't know that you could do this because of just the comparison that would happen between operators. But he said at the time we could kind of keep it pretty low key. But they put those little simple signs that you might see around, a moving company or a garage sale signs. They just put those signs right outside of the Chick-fil-A and we have milkshakes, chocolate, vanilla, $2.99. And when he's telling me about it, I'm like, that had to make people furious, right? I mean, if you heard about this from another restaurant, another Chick-fil-A restaurant, you'd be like, wait, Shane is doing what? He's selling his own milkshakes? And then when I asked him about how they made it, he said, it was as simple as it could be. I mean, we just would go to the grocery store, we'd buy some whole milk, we'd get some Hershey syrup, we'd put the chocolate syrup in there, put the milk in there, and we would just mix it in a blender and sell the milkshake to customers. But he had this, the story, I could go on with loads of details, but it kind of climaxes at this moment where Tim Tassopoulos, who actually just retired as the president of Chick-fil-A, just kind of randomly stopped by Shane's store in Athens. And Shane was, of course, a little bit nervous. He knew that Tim knew about what they were doing, but he didn't know how Tim would handle it. He said the biggest concern about the milkshakes at the time was that it might slow down their drive-through. And he said Tim was asking him about that, and he was like, well, let's just do it. I'll make a milkshake and you make 2 Diet Cokes, and let's see who can make them faster. And he said, he looks at me with this kind of sly look and he goes, Diet Cokes fizz a lot. So I knew that I'd probably be able to handle him on that one. I was like, wow, that was kind of a dirty move. So it sounded like this old Western duel where he's making a milkshake and Tim's making 2 Diet Cokes. And he said, sure enough, he was able to make the milkshake quicker than he could make the 2 Diet Cokes, but really just kind of proving his point. Hey, this isn't going to slow down our drive-through, and I think we could really handle this. He was also quick to say the milkshake Chick-fil-A sells now is not the same milkshake that he was making. They've rolled it in, made it much better, and then rolled it back out. But that story to me is a great example of how to challenge your boss, how to do it in a way where you're not seen as rebellious, where you're not doing it disrespectfully, where you're doing it in a way that fits the confines and fits the core values of the organization, that does it with the kind of excellence and kindness toward customers. Dan Cathy's big slogan at that point was second mile service. And so Shane was so great about saying this whole thing for us was second mile service. It was, we're just going to take your ice cream, we're going to mix it up a little bit to serve the customer. And I thought, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a great way to spin it, right? To make it seem like this is really what the boss is asking of us. And so I love that story. I love that case study of how he did it really well, because I think it's relevant to all of us. All of us have thought, yeah, I mean, I'd like to try that, but maybe they're going to get too mad, or maybe it's going to be too disruptive. And he lays out a great framework on how to challenge the boss really, really well.
When I love, as you tell that story, it's using what we have, taking the values of our organization and innovating in a way that people will take notice and
That's
not
great.
Turn off or switch off. That's a great example. Clay, the landscape of leadership in any setting feels like it has shifted dramatically over the last few years, and it feels that way because it has.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it's evolving at a very rapid pace. What do you think top talent is looking for in their jobs right now?
That's a great question. I think people are looking still for a great culture. I don't think that's changed. You know, that line, Tim, that people use so often, people don't leave their jobs because of fill in the blank. They leave their jobs because of, I feel like I hear so many different things exchanged into those blank. You know, is it because of the boss? Is it because of the, what is it because of what they're allowed to do, or the freedom that they have, or are they allowed to work from home, or are they not? I really believe it is about culture. I mean, that Peter Drucker line that, culture eats strategy for breakfast feels as true now as it ever has. And so working in a culture where there are clearly defined, the win is defined, the mission is defined, the values are defined, and then there's freedom to be able to, as you just mentioned, to be able to take what you have within the confines of the values of the organization and innovate or try something new. The boundaries are clear. I mean, that predictability of being able to wake up every day and know what to expect at work, know what I can depend on at work, all of that, those are all artifacts of great culture. And I think it still is what people are depending on more than anything else. It feels harder now because so many cultures are having to learn how to build themselves and create great ones, both in person and also online, because we're just not it's not about the ping pong table in the break room anymore, because so often people aren't in the break room. I mean, you've got a dispersed workforce all over the United States, and learning how to create great culture with them, that's a new challenge that we didn't have 20 years ago. But just because it is a challenge doesn't mean it's not possible. There's plenty of great companies that have learned how to create great culture, whether they're in person or whether they're leveraging video technology for their workforce or not. But I think that that's one of those tried and true things that seems like it just hasn't really changed, that people, I think, are still looking for and potentially even leaving because of.
Yeah, it's good, Clay. I mean, you would know this when you walk into organizations that you're going to work with. When we do, the first questions are all about identity. Organizations that know who they are, know what they do and how they do it and why they do it. That usually points towards clarity and health. Usually, if there's disparities there or they're unsure, that will define and show us the scope of work that's ahead. I mean, identity determines function. Identity determines direction. Identity determines everything. And so I think that drives culture. Sometimes we describe culture as soul. That determines the soul of the organization.
That's good.
So for experienced leaders, Clay, let's say 40 and above, leaders 40 and above, our experience, it feels like sometimes has perfectly set us up to lead in a world that no longer exists. As you look across multiple generations of leaders and a changing landscape of leadership, what's different now than it was before?
Well, I mentioned the command and control, that style of leadership, learning how to lead out of an influence-based bank account, basically trying to draw on influence and not draw on authority. That would be one. I would add to that just the constant growth in technology, the consistency in which change is happening. Change is avalanching upon our head, and few are prepared for it. The trying to keep up with, whether it's, I mean, I remember somebody at at work while I was at North Point said, all right, I know social media strategy. I know what social is. I know what media is, and I know what a strategy is. But when you put those terms together, what exactly does that mean? Right. Some of the things that we're required to have to understand now. I mean, as a pastor, I remembered, I remember sitting at my desk, looking at dashboards and looking at some of the things that I was trying to figure out, trying to understand marketing better, trying to understand what the difference between a TikTok video and a Vine and a YouTube short and an Instagram reel. That's not something that you talk about in seminary. And that growth in technology, the ever changing world of technology, I just never realized that I was going to have to keep up with that so much as a pastor. And Kevin Kelly wrote a book about the 12 shifts in the world in regard to technology that we all have to pay attention to. And he uses this phrase. He says, because of that, we all have that. We all know what it's like when you click on an app and they've moved the menu and you're like, what in the world, right? I mean, things are constantly updated. New technologies are created all the time. We're going to be constantly stuck in the noob state. I think that's a gaming term that it might be a slight that you might call someone, you're such a noob. But we're all perpetually stuck in that noob state. And so learning to accept that is really important. And then learning to say, you know what? I don't have to have the answers to everything to be a leader. I think there was a day and time when if I knew the most, I was the leader. And so we just naturally equate knowledge with influence or power or leadership. And that's just not going to be true in the future because things are changing so much. You just can't keep up enough. And so being willing and being okay with what you don't know, I think is a new attribute that we're looking for in leaders. But if, the opposite is, what are you going to be? You're going to be a poser, or are you going to act like that when you don't really know? So I would point to that shift particularly for those 40 and above to say, hey, I like the idea of reverse mentoring. Find someone younger than 40 that's going to be a mentor for you. I've got a 30-year-old who's a digital marketing expert, and he's such a gift for me because he's taught me so much that I wouldn't otherwise. He's translated the world for me in a way that I wouldn't have understood it any other way. So I would encourage anyone over 40, get a reverse mentor, get a 28-year-old that's going to teach you something that you didn't already know.
That's really interesting, Clay. We just did a podcast with Todd Bolsinger, who wrote Canoeing the Mountains, and he said that one of the most powerful questions you can, or statements you can say, as a leader is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Because it opens you up to collaborate in such an amazing way. As a Generation Xer, I feel like we as Generation Xers are in a great spot because we can code switch between the boomer leader and the millennial leader. Yeah. And we can learn so much from the millennial and Generation Z leaders that are coming up. I'm learning so much from them. And I'm a product of what I have learned and implemented from the boomer leaders that I've served under.
That's well said.
It's just a great space to be in. You mentioned the shifts we need to make to be effective leaders in the future. You also talked about the 9 ways leadership is changing. As we wind down this conversation, Clay, just pick maybe 1 or 2 of those 9 ways leadership is changing, just to highlight for our listeners.
I'll give you one, and we have time. I'm happy to give another one. But when I was coming up in my 20s, it's wild to think, but Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, was, it still is kind of for some people, it's the leadership Bible. I mean, it's one of the best-selling leadership books of all time, but it's still such a seminal work. But there was a line from that book that would get quoted at work often, that you got to get the right people on the bus. You remember that phrase, Tim? Mm-hmm. Yep. You got to get the right people on the bus. And of course, what Jim Collins was saying is the who is more important than the what, right? Get the who right, and the what will work itself out. I think 20 years ago, if you would have asked me, well, who are the right people? I would have equated right with same. The right people are the ones who think like me. And that's natural for all of us to do that. When someone went to the same school I went to, when someone chose the same background or path that I chose, when they're from the same part of the world, when they talk like me, look like me, whatever, cheer for the same team, we just naturally stroke our own ego with that because it makes us feel like, see there, my way is the right way. And I think we just have to be really careful about that in the future, because if it's true that it ever did mean same, it's certainly not true now, and it's certainly not going to be true in the future. I think getting the right people on the bus means we've got to get some people around us that don't think like us, that don't have the same background to us. I mean, I remember for us in family ministry, when we finally were wise enough to say we need to get some single parents speaking into how we're doing kids ministry and student ministry, because in our minds, I mean, you'd look around the table and you'd go married for 25 years, married for 30 years, married for 18 years. And it's wonderful. I've been married for almost 20 years. Absolutely love my wife. I think most days she loves me. Deeply celebrate people that have been married a long time. But if that's your only lens that you're looking at family ministry through, you're going to miss a significant part of the population that you're only going to see at best every other week anyway. And so learning how to figure out how to connect with them in a different way only happened when we began to realize the value and the power of a single parent, the voice and the vision that they provide it. And that's just one small example. I would just say there's loads of examples of that, but it is on us as leaders to remember that getting the right people on the bus doesn't mean getting the same people, but it really does mean getting people that think different, look different, are different ages, different from different parts of the world. It will only help us when we do that. And it will certainly, I think it's a key to understanding how to reach people for the cause of Christ in the future.
It's the number one way to grow your leadership, Clay. It brings about conflict for sure, healthy conflict, but embrace it, move forward, and it's going to make
it not easier. You're right. It does. It will create conflict, but it will. But it leads to a better place. Yeah,
absolutely. As we close, two last questions. First is speak to the leader of a team who's feeling overwhelmed right now.
Well, if you're leading right now and you're not feeling overwhelmed or discouraged, write in to us and let us know what you're doing, because I think most leaders feel discouraged. It is it almost like it just comes with leadership. I would just say if you are feeling discouraged or overwhelmed, just know that God is clearly in a season where he's growing you. The weight room is difficult because the weights are heavy, and the weights create resistance, and that resistance is how we build strength. And so God, just as sad or difficult it is to wrap our heads around it, he just doesn't grow us near as much when we're in seasons of comfort. And we all know that intuitively, and it's not emotionally satisfying to say, hey, I know things are hard right now, but God's growing you. But there is something there's something powerful about the way God makes the hard times matter, and he brings meaning out of the hard seasons. And so God has not left you, and God's silence or distance, whatever you maybe might be feeling, it's not a sign of his inactivity, but he's certainly growing you and building something in you. And then secondly, I would just say, you will not be able to step into what he has for you in the future without going through what you're going through right now. That he is preparing you for something significant in the future, and having to go through the difficult is how we get there. I mean, this is Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because I know you're with me, and I know there's something on the other side. This is obviously the life of Jesus as well. So if that's you, we have all been there, and many of us are there right now. You are not alone, and God is growing something in you and growing you for something in the future.
I think what you just said can apply to my second question too, which was, you're on a team right now and you feel frustrated and not heard. What's a word for them?
I would say speak up. You got to figure out how to do it, but resentment builds when we don't speak up. And learning how to speak up in a way that is honoring, in a way that is positive. I mean, that really is the thing I love talking about most, is how do you challenge the process with the posture of positivity? If you can learn how to do that, you will be a powerful leader no matter what you do in the future. But if you're frustrated right now, figure out a way to have a conversation, seek clarity about what, the direction that things are moving or the decisions that are being made. But I certainly do not just continue to wallow in it, because that's not going to help you, and it's not going to help the organization or church or whatever it is that you're working for. So I would just encourage you, speak up.
Thanks, Clay. We have mined some gold from your brain today, but also from your writings. People who haven't read your books need to read them. We talked about those titles. How can people get them? How can people connect with you and your coaching?
Well, it's honestly a sincere privilege for me to get to be a part of this. And I know this is not, this is incredibly generous for you to take your spotlight and shine it on me. So thank you. My email address is just clay.scroggins@gmail.com. I don't have an assistant that answers that. That's directly to me. I would love to stay connected, and on LinkedIn would love to connect with you. My website is clayscroggins.com. I send out a weekly newsletter to maybe 13 or 14,000 people a week that people, don't seem to unsubscribe to for the most part. So I hope it's adding value to people. So yeah, I would love to stay connected with you. And if I can do anything to help anyone listening, I feel like my purpose on earth is to serve men and women like the ones that are listening to this podcast today. So thanks for the opportunity, Tim.
Oh, well, thank you, Clay. We're better for it. And this won't be the last conversation. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks.
Well, whether you're at the top of your organization or anywhere else on the org chart, there are practical things from this conversation today you can take away, and questions you can ask yourself and your team that will hopefully help you lead and move forward in a healthy way. Share it with another leader. If you haven't subscribed, we'd love to have you in the Slingshot Group podcast family. Click subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And in the meantime, stay curious and reach for the remarkable.